I want to welcome all of you here for the fourth of 6 Baltimore History Evening talks about history of Baltimore, sponsored by the Baltimore City Historical Society. And as we have been for years, we're generously hosted by the Village Learning Place, which provides this wonderful facility. And I'd like to tend to just a couple housekeeping things, and then we'll get on to what you came here to hear. First, there are sign-in sheets here, and if you haven't signed in, gesture in some modest kind of way, and we will get a clipboard to you. The reason we ask you to sign in is twofold. One is, if you're not on our contact list and you'd like to be, this is a way you can join in. And the second one is, we'd like to know how you heard about the event so that we can orient our publicity to make sure more people come in the future. And then the next thing is, I want to let you know that the Baltimore City Historical Society is a group of volunteers. For better or for worse, we're a nonprofit organization. So we depend upon support from people who love Baltimore history, people who are fascinated by the quirky stories about the city, people who like to tell the stories or hear the stories. So at your seat, you found this piece of paper. And if you take your more or less smartphone and you hover it over the QR code at the bottom, it will take you to a web page where, if you're so inclined, and I'm sure the talk this evening will incline you, you might make a donation to the society. So thanks for considering that. Next month, for the 5th of our talks, on the 3rd Thursday evening of May, Alicia Pugliese will talk about the desegregation of Baltimore hospitals. And I think you'll find that interesting too. So I want to invite you to come back to that as well. Let me tell you about this evening's speakers, and then we'll hear from them. What's really exciting is these are two people from a new generation of Baltimore historians. So it's not simply the old people you hear from, but these are new people with new ways of thinking and new energy to think about Baltimore history. And that's really nice. This is Kristian Whitehead and Gerardo Fontes. And then we'll talk about the Black Panthers in Baltimore and the role of Chester Wickwire, the chaplain at Johns Hopkins, in organizing support for the Panthers, among other causes. The format is, after I finish introducing, they will talk for about 40 or 45 minutes. Around 8:15, 8:20, they'll be finished, and between then and 8:45, we'll have a question and answer period. So if you're excited about something or puzzled about something, feel free to take advantage of that time to ask a question. And we'll continue the discussion in that way. Kristian Whitehead is a senior at Morgan. She's majoring in history and minoring in African American and African diaspora studies. She was awarded a Leadership Alliance summer research internship at the University of Chicago last year. And she has research interests in Black nationalism and women. Gerardo Fontes is a senior at Johns Hopkins, where he's majoring in international studies, political science, and history. He's the co-executive director of the Johns Hopkins Foreign Affairs Symposium. He's had fellowships at the Johns Hopkins Archives, the Alliance for Citizen Engagement. His research interests have to do with the influence of history on policy, which is what we should all be thinking about. Together, both of them have worked with Dr. Victoria Harms in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins. And both of them last year, you may have seen this, curated the exhibition Revolution in Our Lifetime, the Black Panther Party and Political Organizing in Baltimore, 1968 to 1974 at the Peel Museum. So it's great to have new energy, new ideas, and let me just welcome both of you.
Hi, everyone. We want to thank you for coming out tonight, and we're glad to see so many people here. So I want to begin by thanking the Baltimore City Historical Society for inviting us. It's really an honor to be able to speak about the research that we worked on last year. Should this be turned up? Is the audio good? Turn it up. I'm not sure how to turn it up, actually. I'm sorry. Okay, is this better? Okay, perfect. So I also specifically want to thank Aidan Faust of the Baltimore City Historical Society, who helped me immensely in my trips to the University of Baltimore while doing this research. And I want to shout out the team that we worked with in general for the exhibition project, which includes Dr. Harms, Dr. Schrader, and Dr. Furness, Jerry, of course, and then we also work with two other student curators, Ella and Kai. So I'll be speaking with you all tonight about my research on the Black Panther Party, which was titled Dare to Struggle, Dare to Win, the Baltimore chapter of the Black Panther Party's application of Maoism. So on April 16, 1968, Chairman Mao Zedong of the People's Republic of China delivered a speech titled In Support of the Afro-American Struggle Against Violent Oppression. In this speech, Mao condemned the assassination of Dr. King. He placed Black people's mass rebellion after Dr. King's assassination in an anti-colonial and anti-imperialist context, and he expressed his, quote, resolute support of the just struggle of the Black people in the United States. Mao ultimately declared that, quote, only by overthrowing the reactionary rule of the US monopoly class and destroying the colonialist and imperialist system can the Black people in the United States win complete emancipation. And this speech is printed in its entirety here in this map, which was created by the Xinhua Map Publishing House, a national publisher of maps in China. The bottom half of the map features the United States, and it's a map showing 50 rebellions that occurred after Dr. King's assassination. And there are actually 6 speech bubbles on this map which highlight the rebellions that the Chinese map publishers wanted to highlight themselves, and Baltimore City is actually highlighted with its own speech bubble. In the speech bubble, it is described Black Baltimoreans Rebellion, which began on April 6, 1968, 2 days after Dr. King's assassination. The speech bubble describes Black Baltimoreans as having high morale and resilience while fighting military and police repression. And the speech bubble also reported that fires of revenge were started, and they acknowledged the presence of Black snipers. Now, in some ways, the speech bubble is a little exaggerated because the Black snipers, that was kind of disproven with some accounts. But it is significant to note that this map, created by a national map company in China, is really celebrating Black rebellion. It's not necessarily condemnation, which is in contrast to US politicians, mass media, and even some Black civil rights organizers who condemned Black rebellion after Dr. King's assassination. So you kind of get a glimpse as to why the Panthers were attracted to China at this time with its unabashed militancy and revolutionary fervor. So while China looked to cities like Baltimore in the wake of Dr. King's assassination in admiration, Black Baltimoreans too would soon look to China in admiration with the founding of the Baltimore chapter of the Black Panther Party in the fall of 1968. So before I talk about Baltimore specifically, I want to discuss Mao's centrality in the founding of the Black Panther Party. So pictured here is Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, the founders of the Black Panther Party. Was founded in Oakland, California in 1966, and from the beginning, the Panthers were reading Mao. Huey, specifically in his autobiography, he discusses how reading Mao's 4 volumes was essential to seeing socialism as a viable solution for Black liberation. And he was reading, of course, about the Chinese Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution of 1949 was an example of historically disenfranchised people, specifically Chinese peasants, seizing political power through highly organized grassroots organization and, of course, through military battle. As demonstrated in Huey's quote, the Panthers were looking for solutions to Black people's issues of dealing with capitalist exploitation, poverty, police violence, and having no political power, which is why they read from people like Mao and learned about the Chinese Revolution to find solutions to these problems. Additionally, China at the time had a well-established history of battling colonialism directly, such as during World War II against Japan, and of battling US imperialism during the Korean War. So this was really inspiring for the Panthers, who were similarly looking to embark on their own challenge against US imperialism and US colonialism. So one of the first programs that the Panthers enacted was their police patrols, where they would monitor and surveil police in their interaction with Black citizens, and they would open carry their guns, they would read citizens their rights as they were being arrested, and they would also even post bail if necessary. So one of the ways that they needed to raise money for the guns, and one of the ways that they did this was actually by selling Mao's Little Red Book to students on the campus of UC Berkeley, which was interesting. Yes, that Little Red Book, which was interesting because one of Mao's famous quotes is, quote, in order to get rid of the gun, it's necessary to take up the gun. So in many ways, they were facilitating this by selling Mao's Little Red Book. Aside from its use in providing funds for the Panthers and buying their first guns, it was an essential tool of study for the Panthers nationally, and Baltimore was no exception in this case. So pictured here is one of the cases from our exhibit, which features a couple pamphlets of Mao's speeches and his writings, and pictured is the Little Red Book, which was just shown to you. And many Panthers in their autobiographies and also in oral history interviews that they did with others, they noted how central the Little Red Book was to their political consciousness and raising the political consciousness of Black women and men. So from 1960 to 1970, the most printed book in the world was the Little Red Book. And in it, there are about a couple of Mao's quotes, which are patched together from 1927 to 1964. And the book is infused with definitive language, revolutionary fervor, and militant political theory. So I have a picture of Steve McCutcheon, who was a Baltimore Panther. And when he was 19, he joined the Panthers. And before he joined, he asked the Panthers, how do I join? And they explained to him, and they said, but you have to get the Little Red Book before you come to our first political education class. And he writes in his autobiography that when he was told this, he was wondering, quote, what did someone from China have to do with civil rights in Baltimore, let alone anything to do with the Black Panther Party? And in a journal entry that he has published, while he was a Panther for months at this point, he would admit, quote, the Red Book is interesting. I had no idea about the people of the People's Republic of China, this thing called socialism of Ho Chi Minh or Soviet Russia. I'm learning and enjoying. So really, the Panthers' political education classes, and specifically their study of the Little Red Book, was an opening for them to learn about revolutionary politics that they certainly weren't going to learn about in their public school education. And if they were, it was mostly tainted with a negative light considering the United States' endemic anti-communism. So another Panther that really talks about the Panther study of the Little Red Book was Baltimore Panther Eddie Conway in his autobiography. He said that the Little Red Book's simple language made it easy for community members to understand, making it the lifeblood of the Black Panther Party's political training program. In his autobiography, he further stated, quote, we would sometimes spend hours during the class examining a key chapter of the book, with each passage read aloud and discussed by the whole class until there was a general agreement that everyone understood the subject matter. We were young and eager to advance our thinking, and our strong desire for learning was reflected by the fact that we spent hours each night reading and discussing this or that subject from the Little Red Book. So the Panthers were clearly disciplined in their study of the Little Red Book, and for me, hearing how much they read the Little Red Book, I was curious about how did this impact them ideologically and practically in their organizing. And through my study of the Baltimore chapter, I was able to find some answers to this question. So pictured here is John Clark, who was a Baltimore Panther. He came down in August of 1969 to assume the position of defense captain, and Eddie Conway, who I just mentioned, the previous defense captain, Eddie, was very suspicious of him. His name was Warren Hart. He was very concerned about his activities, and so Eddie called the national headquarters. National headquarters came down, they investigated the chapter, and Warren Hart was expelled. So this is the context that John Clark is coming into a chapter that has been kind of ruined by Warren Hart, who was later found out to actually be a government informant. So that's a little on John Clark, but in the Black Panther Party's newspaper, John Clark was a frequent contributor. And one of his articles that stood out to me the most was called Total Emancipation. And in this article, it's very clear John Clark is a socialist, he's an anti-imperialist, and he's very clear on the necessity for revolutionary war. And this is one parallel that I found between John Clark and Mao, their insistence on the necessity for revolutionary war. And for Mao and Clark, this was not a decision or a position that was made out of spontaneity. It was a decision that they evaluated, and they considered the conditions in each of their countries and decided that revolutionary war was their only path towards liberation. So to discuss this further, I want to read a quote from Mao, which is one of his many famous, he has many famous quotes, but this is certainly one of them. So he says, quote, we are advocates of the abolition of war. We do not want war, but war can only be abolished through war. Now this may seem contradictory, but from Mao's position, he understood that imperialist governments need war. They benefit from war through profits, and the only way that war can be abolished is through an actual military confrontation with an imperialist government. John Clark agreed with this, and he assessed that the United States was incessantly imperialist. And for John Clark, he understood that the only way to end the systemic oppression of Black people and to end U.S. imperialism was through war. John Clark says, quote, in Total Emancipation, he says, quote, we don't want to fight for a single day or even an hour, but conditions are forcing us to defend ourselves, And we will, by any means necessary, against this imperialist interloper that is trying to colonize the whole world with the threat of nuclear war if a nation refuses to submit. John Clark further wrote about how Black people have exhausted their nonviolent tactics. You know, it's not a tactic that works anymore. We're no longer appealing to the moral consciousness of America. He goes on to conclude, quote, "There can be no peace in this world as long as imperialism exists. Therefore, the masses of oppressed people all over the world must unite and engage in a bloody battle for the purpose of wiping out imperialism once and for all." So John Clark has demonstrated his wish for peace, but he's also concurring with Dr. King in his Beyond Vietnam speech when he says that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. John Clark pushes this a little further and notes that because the United States is the largest purveyor of violence in the world, they must be met with a consequence, and this consequence for him was revolutionary war. So Mao and Clark, they're aligned on not wanting to engage in war just for the fun of it, but they understood it as a necessary step to create the socialist societies they strove for and to destroy US imperialism. So another example of that I saw the Panthers kind of taking Mao's ideas but adapting it for their own conditions was through their policy papers. So pictured on the right, or yes, on your right, is a snapshot from Sophia Bukhari's policy papers. Sophia Bukhari was a New York Panther, but these papers were distributed nationally. So you can see that it describes the aim and the motto of the Panthers. So the aim says, the Black Panther Party is an armed body for carrying out the political tasks of the revolution. The motto of the Black Panther Party is described as, "We are advocates of the abolition of war. We do not want war, but war can only be abolished through war. And in order to get rid of the gun, it is necessary to pick up the gun." So I did just read this quote briefly to you earlier, and that's because this is taken directly from Mao's 1928 writings, where he discussed problems of war and strategy. So this is a direct influence of Mao on the Panthers' policy. On the left, I have a graph, it's kind of a graph, of the Black Panther Party's 3 rules of discipline and their 8 points of attention. Now, both of these sets of rules actually come from the Red Army's own set of rules created in 1928. And these rules were created so that Red Army soldiers' conduct was honorable and to maintain respect between the peasantry and the soldiers. And the 1928 rules, they kind of changed, so there was a change in 1947. So what the Panthers are taking from is the 1947 rules, but they originate in 1928. I have 4 sections highlighted of the Panthers' modifications, but I'm going to talk about one for the sake of time. And I'm going to be talking about their 8th point of attention. So the Red Army's 8th point of attention states, "Don't ill-treat captives." This is one of their rules. The Panthers say, "If we ever have to take captives, do not ill-treat them." So this modification is reflective of the Panthers' defensive but their proactive stance. They maintain that they will not attack unless attacked, and that is why they call themselves the Panthers. They frequently said the Black Panther only attacks if it's attacked first, and when it's attacked, it backs all the way up and it completely wipes out its opponent. So this modification to Mao's writings shows that they were maintaining the integrity of why their organization was founded while still taking from something that the Chinese soldiers were adhering to. I want to talk about the influence of Mao on the Panthers' integration of theory and practice. So Mao heavily emphasized the integration of theory and practice. To only engage in theory over practice means you're just talking. To only engage in practice and no theory means you could be engaging in some reactionary ideas because you're not guided by a principle. And Huey Newton, which I mentioned is the co-founder of the Black Panther Party, in 1971, he took a trip to China with Panthers Elaine Brown and Robert Bay. And in his autobiography, he reflects on Mao and what China meant to him at the time that Bobby Seale and him were founding the Panthers. And he says, quote, "For this is what Bobby Seale and I had concluded in our discussions 5 years earlier in Oakland as we explored ways to survive the abuses of the capitalist system in the Black communities in America. Theory was not enough, we had said. We knew we had to act to bring about change. Without fully realizing it then, we were following Mao's belief that, quote, if you want to know the theory methods of revolution, you must take part in revolution. All genuine knowledge originates in direct experience." So one of the best examples of the Panthers' integration of theory and practice was, of course, their survival programs. And in Baltimore, the Panthers' survival programs included the Free Breakfast for Children program, which an article is featured here on your right of the Free Breakfast for Children program. They briefly ran a cooperative grocery store where they intentionally sold groceries for less compared to other local grocers. They helped establish the People's Community Health Center with other organizations such as the the Coalition of Women's Liberation, and the Baltimore Defense Committee, and this was located on Greenmount Avenue and lasted until 2014. Pictured on your left is the Panthers, the Baltimore Panthers free clothing and shoe program. So my favorite picture from our entire exhibit is the picture that's featured in the middle, and it's from inside the Baltimore chapter's Free Breakfast for Children program. You can see a loaf of bread, a Skippy peanut butter jar in the middle, and Mal's Combat Liberalism is sitting strategically right next to it all. And I thought it's just really emblematic of the Panthers' integration of theory and practice. And Mal's Combat Liberalism is a short work where Mal outlines a code of conduct for revolutionary organizations. And he says that revolutionaries should be abiding by discipline, selflessness, and an unwavering dedication to the masses. And they should be abandoning liberalism, which is when you, even if you have an argument, you're trying to engage in peace. You're not really trying to engage the argument with your revolutionaries, with your comrades. And he said that liberalism also has selfish attributes. So he says these must be abandoned. And I think that the Baltimore Panthers, and just the Panthers nationally, in their work, were abiding by Mao's declaration that revolutionaries and organizers should have a type of discipline, a selflessness, and dedication to the masses. So I want to conclude with one of the enduring takeaways I had from doing this research, which was the Panthers' rejection of the United States geopolitical line on countries that the US deemed as enemies is what facilitated their internationalism and their affinity for countries such as China. The Panthers would have never looked to Mao or Ho Chi Minh or Kim Il-sung or Patrice Lumumba or Che Guevara if they abided by a staunch anti-communism that was propagated by Americans throughout its centuries of existence, particularly with the Russian Revolution. And when Huey came back from his 1971 trip, this is actually some pictures from that trip, but when he came back, he did a press conference and he told the press, quote, "Many of you are not aware. You don't know your friends and you don't know your enemies, therefore you confuse them. We invite you to try very hard, however, to cut through the brainwashing of the mass media, the TV, and the soap opera so that you can save your lives and see that your descendants and your generation will live and not die." So the Panthers' rejection of US propaganda, which illogically positioned the US as a beacon of democracy or the moral arbiter of so-called justice globally, was the gateway for their internationalist politics, which united them with the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist rhetoric of Mao and the legacy of the Chinese Revolution. So thank you all for listening.
I was his janitor. I used to be his janitor.
Hi everyone. Again, round of applause. That was really great, Kristian. It's been really great to kind of work together for a year and a half, 2 years now, however long it's been. I feel like we've both seen each other really learn and grow, just get to know and learn so much. Definitely know a lot more about Baltimore, the Black Panther Party, just a lot more than I thought I would know coming in and arriving here in Baltimore 4 years ago. But like I just said, I really want to thank the Baltimore City Historical Society for this opportunity. I will say I was in Madrid on my bed. I was studying abroad last semester when I found out about this opportunity. I was not really thinking about Baltimore at the time. I was thinking about tapas and jamon serrano, we'll be honest. But nonetheless, I was very excited to come back to Baltimore and speak on the research I've done and continued throughout about Chester Wickwire. So yeah, I'm really excited tonight to kind of share not just the forgotten history, but the untold story really about Reverend Dr. Chester Wickwire. For those of you who don't know, the former chaplain at Johns Hopkins University, who spent over 30 years in the city, at the university, serving the university, but at the end of the day, really helping tear down the wall that a lot of times divides Johns Hopkins from the rest of Baltimore. So in order to just kind of introduce him a little bit and understand kind of what he was about, I wanted to kind of start just with who he was, first of all. So Chet the Jet was a name that he was given to by a lot of his students. I'll go into a little bit later why the name was a little funny, but wanted to touch on a little bit about some of the ways that people described him, faculty, students, just general people who knew him. So, for example, one quote from a columnist at the Baltimore Sun said, "Describing Chester Wickwire as a campus chaplain is like describing Da Vinci as a fellow detained." Another faculty member at Johns Hopkins said he wants everything to be better to the point that it's a little too much for me sometimes. But I like what he's done. He's one of my heroes. Another faculty member said he would egg people on, but at the same time try to make them be responsible. Another one said he was a very peculiar person, but he was very, very good. Similarly, students also shared a lot of these same sentiments. Seeing him as someone that they could look up to. Dr. Leslie King Hammond, who was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University and knew Wickwire, described him saying he was an archangel, a man ahead of his time, and our patron saint. And then also I had the opportunity to speak to one of his living sons, Brian Wickwire, and he said, talking about his dad, that he never questioned what he was doing over his 30 years, and it was a really great conversation. But I think a lot of these quotes, what they really say about him, about Chet, the Jet, is really how he was an example for the people around him. And for me, hearing about this, the way he was spoken about, to me seems really interesting, and wondering why his story in Baltimore City, in the larger context of activism, the university's history, has really been thrown to the wayside and not discussed enough. So for me, what I wanted to do and understand Wickwire was really understand what made him who he was before he arrived here to Baltimore and at Hopkins, what he was doing, and then really what were those connections that he was building in the city with groups like the Baltimore Black Panthers. So before arriving at Hopkins, just to kind of provide a little understanding of who he was. So he's originally not from Baltimore, from Nebraska, born in 1913, was raised in Colorado Springs, Colorado. His mother was, according to interviews he's done, a very religious person, religious zealot, and he was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist. He talks a lot about his experience growing up in Colorado. Originally, obviously from Nebraska, his parents moved to Colorado during the Great Depression, and he kind of talks about his experience when they were kind of moving westwards. In a quote in an interview he did back in 2006, he said, "We started living out in a circular tent from the First World War. The tent we were sleeping in, that one tent caught on fire and burned down. Then we went underground, and my father, he built a cave dugout for me, which we moved into. So we lived in that. We were underground." So, I think, and this is a picture of him too that I was able to find in the archives at UB. This is a picture later in his life when he, growing up very religious as a Seventh-day Adventist. He later went on to be an evangelical preacher, kind of traveling around in the area. And so at the end of the day, this experience, early on of hardship, poverty, especially the religious influence, really carried on much later. So much so that after leaving Colorado, he went to Yale to study at Yale's Divinity School, graduated with a Bachelor's of Divinity from Yale in 1947, and then went on to get his Doctorate of Divinity at Yale in 1948. And his time at Yale and at Yale Divinity School is something that he talks a lot about, being very influential to his experience and how he viewed the world. At this time as Yale, when he was there's a wide range of professors and faculty like Peter Tillich, the Nuremberg brothers, who were really pushing for a new way of thinking about religion, and particularly Christianity during the 20th century, understanding how this changing world that was leaving a lot of people to the wayside, that wasn't really creating a society that a lot of them viewed as not the one that God had envisioned in the Bible and the values that it was purporting. And so, a piece of scripture that he cites a lot that's very influential is Amos 5:24, "Let justice roll down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream." And so, for me, kind of understanding his time at Yale, it's really a lot about the ways that the professors that he was interacting with, the conversations he was having about his religion, really influenced that moral compass that he developed. It was very interesting talking to his son, who kind of mentioned that we'd have these long conversations, him and his dad, Chester Wickwire, and that at the end of the day, kind of coming from Yale, he remembers that he didn't necessarily believe in the dogma of the Bible, but much more about the messages of right and wrong and moral justice, which I thought was really interesting. But besides the religious upbringing and his experience at Yale, the other aspect that really influenced him was his polio. So right before he started at Yale to get his doctorate, he in 1948 came down with polio during kind of the rising polio epidemic towards the end of the 1940s, where cases had spiked. And at the time, what happened was basically, he recalls that, to basically fund his time at Yale, he was selling wonder horses, which I did not know what they were, but they were the little rocking horses. I would imagine some of you don't. I found that out. But he was selling those, and obviously having polio, being in the hospital, not able to really sell many wonder horses. So he came down with polio, and for 7 months was put into a pauper's ward in New Haven, Connecticut, which is the picture here on the left. And that experience for him was really formative. He recalls in an unpublished essay that I was able to find in the archives titled, "It Was Good for Me." He kind of talks about this experience in the pauper's ward, and he mentions, quote, "I saw suffering and sadness in the harshest colors, unsoftened by economic security and social status. I had never so intimately felt the impact of the troubles and the sorrows that are a part of so many people." So I think, for me, that really emphasized how his experience, kind of being in a pauper's ward, he talks a lot about, waking up and seeing one person falling asleep, and then the next day that person is no longer there. He talks about, that experience really helping him understand the inequality in the world and the need for empathy and action to deal with a lot of the issues that he was seeing while his time there. He talks a lot about, too, the suffering and poverty, the loneliness that at the end of the day, for anyone, was a great equalizer, and that for him, gave him this new sense of moral clarity and a challenge really to respond to that injustice that he was perceiving. I think what's most interesting about his time with polio, obviously there's a lot more I'm going to talk about today. So he was able to survive, but the reason for that, he talks about this relationship that he had and was able to create with Eleanor Roosevelt through basically a friend who had visited him when he was in New Haven, got to know him and his story, and she was able to kind of pull some strings and end up having him recover from polio down in Georgia at Warm Springs Foundation, the same place where FDR recovered from his polio. But what I find most interesting about that story, and that's him here on the right, is Warm Springs, Georgia, and the Warm Springs Foundation was a place where only white individuals who had polio were able to go to. There was no space for black patients. And so, for me, in a way, that kind of speaks to, obviously, Whitworth had that opportunity, but there's, thousands of others who didn't. And so in a way, that kind of touches a little bit on his positionality, who he is, and his identity, and how that influenced a lot of the spaces he was able to be a part of and enter. In a way that kind of follows him throughout his time, especially when he arrives at Hopkins. So, with that understanding of kind of what shaped his worldview, his moral compass, and who he was, in 1953 he arrives at Johns Hopkins as Executive Secretary of Levering Hall, YMCA, and the Coordinator of Religious Affairs at Levering Hall. For those who haven't been on the Johns Hopkins campus, Levering Hall is a building pretty much right smack dab in the middle of campus. I'd say most students on campus have been there at some point or another. But he arrives in 1953, and Levering Hall was, as I mentioned, a pretty hybrid space. It wasn't Hopkins, it wasn't YMCA, it was this weird in-between the two, which really allowed Wickwire with a lot of ambiguity as to what his role really meant. He mentions in interviews that when he would, create a new program, start a new initiative, he says, quote, "If the Y didn't like it, what we were doing, they could blame the university. If the university didn't like what we were doing, they could blame the Y." So this ambiguity between his position and who he belonged to and who, at the end of the day, was responsible for what he was doing, allowed him a lot of space to kind of go do one thing, say the other thing, do another. And I think over his time, particularly when he arrived at Hopkins, you can really see that. And so just kind of provide a little understanding. I don't want to go through every single thing he did. I mean, I could probably be here for hours and hours talking about everything he's done. But, I just wanted to kind of focus on the biggest things that I thought were particularly interesting. So for the first couple of years, a big part of his position was typical university things. He organized freshman year orientation. He organized the student handbook. But on top of that, he was also responsible for a lot of lecture series, bringing speakers to campus. And what I thought was particularly interesting was him inviting a lot of the same theologians and professors that he had at Yale to campus, Paul Tillich, the Niebuhr brothers, in a way to kind of bring those conversations about religion, Christianity to the students at Johns Hopkins. Additionally, another really interesting point is in November 16, 1958, Chester Wickwire organizes the first interracial jazz concert in Baltimore down at the 5th Regiment Armory, featuring artists such as Dave Brubeck, Mayor Ferguson, Chris Connor. Over 4,500 people attend from all over Baltimore and in the region. He talks about how this experience was particularly interesting because you had lawyers from Hopkins and the Y, both very concerned about a race riot happening, about all the disorder that might occur. They were drafting, legal documents just in case. And the JHU newsletter puts it very poignantly saying the crowd applauded and cheered, but never became disorderly. So I think it's really interesting this moment. He understood very much so the meaning of jazz, particularly in this moment in 1958, the significance it had during the civil rights movement, how jazz was being used, not only here in the US, but abroad, to really signify a movement for change. Additionally, a really impactful moment for Whitbar, particularly towards the beginning of the 60s, was his visit to the Soviet Union in 1961. He took a group of students, I'm not sure how they approved that at Hopkins, to take them to the Soviet Union so they could see the experience, get to know what the other side was like. However, during his time there, he was stopped by Russian forces. They accused them of bringing pamphlets, Western and American propaganda. They had a whole people's trial. Students were there. It was a very politicized thing. And he recalls coming back to the U.S. after that experience with a greater appreciation for the civil liberties, civil rights, and the freedom of expression that the United States provides. And he really focused on wanting that be something that he always focuses on and kept kind of front of mind when it comes to the way he wanted to go about his activism. So particularly kind of towards the beginning, in the 1960s, Johns Hopkins had some students that were starting to get involved in the civil rights through the Civic Interest Group, which was an interracial student group focused on desegregating Baltimore businesses in the area. Northwood Theater, for example, near the Morgan campus, was a segregated movie theater. Hopkins students started interacting and working with Morgan State students. There's stories about them waiting in line in pairs as interracial couples. They would go up, try and ask for tickets. They would get rejected. Sometimes the police would come in, pull out just the Hopkins students, say like, "Hey man, what are you doing here? You gotta go." Trying to break that collaboration that was happening. And in a way, part of what the students were doing also influenced and helped Whitwire understand what was happening outside of campus, understand the issues that were facing students, if there was businesses, apartment complexes in the local area in Charles Village near Johns Hopkins campus that weren't allowing Black students. There's a very famous story about the Blue Jay restaurant on St. Paul Street. It was a Greek restaurant that wouldn't allow Black students to go in. It was very known that the owner was staunch racist and didn't want to let people in, so much so that when Duke Ellington came to try and eat at the restaurant, he walked in and he said, "No, it's closed," and then the next night the restaurant burned down. Are you serious? But yeah, I think in a way, that really points to kind of the ways that students and Whitwire were having those interactions. Levering was really the place that these student groups were meeting, having conversations, and it being a space where, I can imagine students were meeting, Whitwire kind of pop in his head, see what was going on, have conversations, understand what the injustices that they were experiencing in the local community, and how he might be a resource to provide. On top of just kind of, creating concerts and being a space for students, he also brought a lot of different speakers to campus. One particularly that I noted in this early period was Bayard Rustin in 1966, the notable organizer of the March on Washington in 1963. The president of Johns Hopkins at the time, Milton S. Eisenhower, brother of the president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, supposedly said, referring to Bayard Rustin, quote, "Do I have to let that son of a bitch speak?" So it's clear, the opposition that, Whitwire was facing from administration with some of the speakers he was bringing, such as Bayard Rustin. Additionally, kind of focusing more on the support he was giving for students. Students for a Democratic Society, the chapter that formed at Hopkins, formed pretty early and was quite involved in anti-Vietnam War protests, particularly also a lot of the civil rights activism that was happening. Additionally, kind of related more to the Vietnam War protests and kind of anti-war movements, Chester Whitwire was one of the only religious leaders in Baltimore that was authorized to visit conscientious objectors down at Fort Meade. And so, it was really interesting in the archives, kind of seeing this part of his experience. The folder of all the letters that he was receiving is probably about this thick, and kind of going through and everyone trying to have chances to talk to him, see what he was doing, have those conversations. Another really interesting project he started was the tutorial project, a still ongoing project helping to connect Baltimore students to Hopkins students. In 1958, he started a tutorial project with the goal of connecting Hopkins students to the larger Baltimore community and Baltimore youth. Initially, students went directly into homes across the city, which for him was a way to really connect students and to expose them to areas of the city and to experiences that they had never seen before. He cites that tutors came to know their families as a unit and thus learned a great deal about the ghetto, which is not available from textbooks and courses. Whitwire is really big on this idea that the best way to learn about the issues that were playing in communities in the city was to really see it. So he started a lot of courses introducing students to go see court cases, understand what the issues that were playing in Baltimore and the inner city really were like by going out into them. Before that, Hopkins really hadn't been offering any kind of courses in this area, kind of courses focused on introducing students to what those issues were. And a lot of times he faced opposition for it. Multiple times administration would try and say, your courses aren't approved, they're not in this department, what are you doing you don't have a syllabus or a TA, a lot of complicated administrative higher education jargon to try and get his program stopped or limited or kind of prevent students from going out and about. Just to name a couple more things he was doing, just kind of list things off: AWARE, probation aid program, legal advocacy, juvenile delinquency program, inner city fund, Chester's Place, which was the second floor of Levering Hall where he would invite people to come perform. It was a space for students to go, have food, drink, international folk dancing, and more. I could go on and on and on and on and on about every program he did and be here all day. But what I really want to focus on is kind of where that shift occurred in his organizing and where especially that relationship with the Panthers began. And so, as I might assume maybe some of you know, kind of thinking about the history of Baltimore, 1968 is quite an important moment. In 68, in April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and in Baltimore, this kind of triggered a larger, widespread uprising across the city, part of a national wave of urban revolts from the period. Particularly what's interesting about Baltimore is that, after this week, Governor Spiro Agnew declares a state of emergency, the National Guard comes into the city. Chester Wickwire, with a couple of other organizers, creates the Committee for Responsible Leadership. In response to April 11th, 1968, Governor Agnew gives a speech at the Conference with Civil Rights and Community Leaders here in Baltimore, basically talking about what happened in the uprising. They expected going in to have a conversation about the issues that were plaguing them, why communities were so concerned about this, and basically Agnew does the entire opposite, blames community leaders for what's going on, says it's your fault, you instigated this, saying, quote, "You were beguiled by the rationalization of unity, stung by insinuations that you were Mr. Charlie's boy, by epithets like Uncle Tom." And so, at the end of the day, in response to this, a majority of the Black community leaders leave the conference. They're incensed, and so Wickwire organizes a Committee for Responsible Leadership, which tries to get published this ad that you see over here calling for a time for positive leadership, basically asking Governor Agnew to apologize for the comments, to want to work with community members. And what's particularly interesting about the ad is that Wickwire initially approaches the Baltimore Sun to try and get it published. The Baltimore Sun says, no, we're not going to publish that. He goes to the Afro, the News American. They finally get it published, and it isn't until other newspapers do that finally the Baltimore Sun does publish it, which is not this one right here. They end up publishing a smaller version. This is from the Afro-American, but I think it's particularly interesting, that relationship. I think what's really interesting about this moment in post-1968 Baltimore and how Wickwire kind of approached organizing was that, Wickwire recognized a major shift in how activism and civil rights organizing was transitioning from the interracial organizing of the civil rights period and kind of the legal successes towards the Black nationalism and more self-determination that we see it particularly with the Baltimore Black Panther Party. And so his approach, coming from Hopkins, was to redirect his efforts towards education, particularly white communities, on racism and privilege and white accountability, and understanding how systemic inequality had created the environment that the successes of the civil rights movement hadn't been able to deal with. So as part of that, the Committee for Responsible Leadership kind of then ended up becoming an organization known as Response, which aimed to combat white racism in Baltimore. They also founded the Freedom School, also called the Free University, in October of 1968, which was organized by Wickwire and various other Hopkins faculty members and other allies within the community, which was focused on educating white residents about systemic racism, urban inequality, social justice. In part of their marketing about the Freedom School, they say, quote, "The Freedom School is a resource to the frustration of concerned white citizens to educate themselves about urban and racial problems." During its first inaugural session or semester, the Freedom School would offer a variety of classes, including Urban Crisis in Black and White, which is this kind of flyer right here, Public Welfare, the Myth of Help, Black Organizations and Aims, and the Power Structure in Baltimore. I think importantly, Response, the Freedom School, and the Free University, like I mentioned, really reflect that shift into understanding how could Wickwire apply his resources to a different lens, change a little bit about what he was doing in response to larger changes that were happening into the city, and to how particularly Black communities wanted to see activism and change within their communities. And so that kind of leads into how this connection between Wickwire and the Panthers comes about. So I came into this understanding Wickwire particularly from a Hopkins lens, and this really came about simply just through exploring and kind of coming out pretty much out of nowhere, which I thought was really particularly interesting. So in December of 1969, Wickwire and a lot of the similar organizers and activists that had formed Response and a lot of similar other programs after '68 organized the Baltimore Committee for Political Freedom. Basically, this is created in response to the Panthers having been a victim of political repression across the nation, particularly in response to Fred Hampton's assassination in Chicago, basically acting as an intermediary between the Panthers and police, saying, we want to avoid violence in the city, unnecessary bloodshed. What I find really interesting is also the connections outside of Wickwire. SDS, for example, this was a headline from an article in the JH newsletter about SDS meeting in Levering Hall, hosted by the Black Panthers. In the article, the person who's there is Warren Hart, which, as Kristian mentioned, was an FBI informant. So it's particularly interesting thinking about that in the context with the FBI, SDS, Panthers, him going to Hopkins, with Wickwire being there. And I'll touch a little bit on that, kind of why those relationships are also particularly interesting. As I mentioned, the Baltimore Committee for Political Freedom organized in various ways trying to support the Panthers. One particular example was that in the winter of 1969, several members of the Baltimore Police Department looked on. The Baltimore Gas and Electric Company shut off the gas and services to the Panthers headquarters. There's kind of like a video that I think we had in the exhibit of them digging up the power lines and turning them off. And so the Baltimore Committee for Political Freedom collected donations from its members in the community to help pay for the Panthers' outstanding bill, and this is one of those receipts that I was able to find, which was really interesting because I kind of look at this first and I'm like, I have no idea what this is. This is just a random receipt. But it was particularly interesting. And so then in February of 1970, after collecting donations, the organization then comes and helps pay off the bill, restoring power to their headquarters down at Gate Street. Additionally, the committee would then also release several statements in support of the Panthers. For example, in May of 1970, after the injunction against the Panthers newspaper, and a wave of Panther arrests across the city, they released a statement. They also tried meeting with the governor of Maryland at the time, Marvin Mandel, to try and discuss the police repression and the Panthers were facing. Unsuccessfully were able to meet. Additionally, Wickwire kind of talks about other relationships. He recalls in one interview, quote, "One night I got a call from the Panthers. They said, quote, 'Would you come down here to Gate Street headquarters because we got word that the police are coming around to shoot us up tonight.' So I went down there and was with them for an hour or two. We had people then, students who were like standing outside to try and see and then be of some kind of protection. We never had a serious shootout in the city." I think what's particularly interesting about this relationship with the Panthers and with Wickwire is that it's not necessarily agreeing with the vision that they had for Baltimore, for their communities. A lot of what Kristian was talking about. In a way, it's supporting the unnecessary bloodshed, their right to express themselves, to have those civil liberties, to be able to distribute their newspapers. So in a way, it's not necessarily him being a radical revolutionary, maybe like the Panthers were, but much more viewing it from the lens of what he had done before and simply wanting to protect another's group ability to organize similarly like I had done before. Like I mentioned, obviously Wickwire didn't do this all without no criticism and opposition. That there was plenty of to go around. As I mentioned earlier, in 1966, for example, Bayard Rustin speaks on campus, and before the event, right outside, the KKK, National States' Rights, basically pickets. The night before he speaks, there's the cross burning on campus as well. And these are things that are not talked about. I didn't know about this, and this happening, right on campus in front of where Rustin was set to speak a couple of hours later is particularly interesting. Additionally, on top of that, he also, receives a lot of mail. It's very funny. In the archives that he has at Hopkins, there's a folder about maybe this big of him saying, it says Wickwire good letters, and the other one says Wickwire bad letters. And so these are some that I pulled out from the bad letters pile. The one on the left is basically saying any minister participating in politics should no longer be recognized as a leader in a house of worship. This one, especially related to the Panthers in particular, mentions, quote, "I think you might be better to devote your energies to a more appropriate objective than to alleged harassment of the Black Panther Party. Surely you are not naive enough to believe that a gang of armed radical Negroes are entitled to polite kid-glove treatment rather than stern, no foolishness moves, such as any other hard-boiled law breakers receive." So clearly a lot of times these are coming from alumni, people in the community that knew Wickwire. And so I thought it was really interesting, that a lot of times, particularly when in his relationship with the Panthers, is that, people see Wickwire, they know he's related to Hopkins. Hopkins supports the Panthers. And so a lot of times, that creates backlash, particularly from administration, who's concerned about this relationship. There's a lot of worry about, how that perception is. There's calls a lot of times for Wickwire to be fired. A lot of times students rally around, sign petitions to try and keep him in his position. But I thought that was particularly interesting, a lot of these letters. Additionally, on top of that, kind of related to, as I mentioned, Warren Hart being an FBI informant, it was later found out that Commissioner Donald Pomerleau of the Baltimore PD, featured right here, was basically had his own version of COINTELPRO, the FBI's program of tracking subversive organizations like the Black Panthers nationally. But Commissioner Pomerleau had his own version of COINTELPRO much more locally. And in it wasn't revealed much later, for example, that in 1974, that Pomerleau and his Internal Services Division basically kept dossiers on subversive individuals and groups, which included organizations like the Students for a Democratic Society, the Baltimore Black Panther Party, Johns Hopkins Tutorial Project, and Chester Wickwire himself. It's very interesting. Wickwire kind of talks about this experience, obviously finding about this much later, saying Commissioner Pomerleau was, quote, "of course, highly incensed by what we did, and I know he publicly bragged about having taped me. He had conversations of mine with the Panthers. He bragged about that over at a meeting of the black leaders at the Afro." Additionally, on top of that too, if anyone knows kind of the area around campus, the telephone building, which is now an apartment complex, used to be an actual telephone building. And it was later revealed in the JHU newsletter that it was also reported that the FBI and Donald Pomerleau was also using that building, wiretapping a lot of students' conversations, particularly also Chester Wickwire. I think that what's really interesting is understanding how Wickwire obviously a lot of times found out about the much more covert things later, but at the end of the day, he's facing a lot of criticism and opposition, even in much more overt ways. Clearly, with the KKK and presence of white nationalists in Baltimore, which is quite crazy to think about. Just thinking a little bit more about Wickwire nowadays and how he's thought about. So he remains at Hopkins from 1953 until 1984 when he retires. This is the last edition of the JHU yearbook, the Hullabaloo, which is dedicated in his honor. Today, I would say, kind of thinking about what are the concrete legacies of Wickwire on campus and in Baltimore. On campus, definitely the JHU tutorial project still remains in a very different way. Students aren't going into the city, students come to campus, which is very different, creates a different environment. The Center for Social Concern at Johns Hopkins, which in a way takes up the role of managing the tutorial project, but also tries to do a lot of those initiatives of pushing people to campus, creating community-based courses, like one I took with Dr. Victoria Harms, which introduced me to Wickwire at the beginning. But what I find particularly interesting is this washing of his name on campus. The only mention I've found of his name anywhere is this one plaque, which is behind a door in Levering Hall, which is sometimes closed, that goes up to the second floor where the Apocalypse mural is, where the JHU tutorial project is. And for me, thinking about how he's been remembered and thought about, I think what's really interesting is in 2000, there was a commission history done of the university by named Warren, a big celebration of the Hopkins history, and she does this through 55 different oral histories that she does of students, alumni, faculty, people that work at the university all across Johns Hopkins. And reading the oral histories, Wickwire's name comes up a lot. She asks repeatedly students, faculty, and says a lot of times, like, I'm an admirer of Wickwire based on the conversations I've heard. But when you read the history, he's mentioned, once in passing his quote talking about the Vietnam War and anti-protest. So I think it's particularly interesting that, his history has been, in a way, actively washed away, forgotten, left to the wayside, particularly someone that touched on so many students for, over 30 years. And so, for me, thinking about how, I would like for him to be remembered, having done all this and thinking about, why is this person remembered? I think, for students, for faculty, for anyone, I think he represents both ways that, Hopkins doesn't have to be a monolith. There can be individuals within it that are fighting for, just causes, for social activism, that can be collaborators with other organizations within the community, in particular, and use resources sometimes at their disposal to do so. Not saying that washes away anything that Johns Hopkins has done in the community, especially, I mean, that's not how I see him, but I do see him as someone that can be an example for students who sometimes come to university and want to stay stuck on campus, but rather can think about that there is a legacy of connecting with the city and connecting with Baltimore, and groups such as the Baltimore Black Panther Party. So yeah, thank you so much.
Very nice, very nice. Well, we have time for questions, so I'm sure there's things you'd like to ask. You have a question?
Hi, I've got several questions.
Well, we have time for one.
I have a statement, please. My name is Alan Barish. I was janitor for Chester Whitwater in 1968 when I got out of Shepherd Prep. I was a printer for the Black Panther Party. I was the sole person in this city to distribute Chinese propaganda. I also want to point out there was two threads that go through this. At the same time that Johns Hopkins University was supporting the Panthers, and I was one of the people that slept out in front of the Black Panther Party headquarters when the attack went out, there was another trend. It was the Lyndon LaRouche trend. That was the SDS Labor Committee that was organized at Johns Hopkins University by Zeke Boyd, who was kicked out of the Black Panther Party for male chauvinism and hitting on women every time they went in. He, along with an infamous aide, Robert Kaufman, who was kicked out of Sparta Street for embezzling money, formed the SDS Labor Committee, which then became whatever, I don't know.
Okay, would you like to pose a question to the speakers?
But anyway, that's one thing. And the second thing I want to point out is I was a victim of Parmer's. I was a victim of Parmer's piggishness. I worked with a group of people called the Mother Jones Collective. We had a 1250 multi press in the basement of our house, which, if any of you have matched with color printers, you better thank God you've got it.
It's important for everyone to have a chance to talk. If you have a question, please ask a question, because I want to make sure other people have a chance to ask
The police
questions.
raided my headquarters and smashed the press because we were doing printing for the Black Panther Party. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Yes. Go ahead, please.
I have a question for both of you about what.
I can offer you this if you like.
I can do that.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a question for both of you about what sources did you guys find most useful? What accesses to archives? What papers did you find like most beneficial? I mean, if you could just each of you name two sources.
Let me just repeat this for people who are on Zoom. I know everyone could hear you. The question has to do with what are the sources each of the speakers used in doing their research.
I think for me, definitely oral histories, talking to people is super useful, especially when, I guess the 60s and 70s are, there's still people alive who experienced the time, and I think for me, it's very useful to just hear those stories from people. No disrespect. I truly, I think, a lot of times I've definitely learned to appreciate that there's stories that get lost to time, and I think, it's unfortunate when you hear a name that repeatedly comes up and no one's gotten a chance to interview them. An example that comes up, I was able to talk to the Student Association president in 1968 at Hopkins. He'd never done any sort of oral history, but his name kept coming up. He was, related to the Panthers, had worked with Whitehead. His name was kind of on a lot of petitions he had signed, but no one had ever asked him. So I think for me, that's the most important thing is, when you're able to find a story from someone and then also compared to other things you find, I think it's really great because at the end of the day, history is about people. So
Yeah, I agree with Jerry.
Do you want to?
Oh,
Do you mind?
oh, sure. So I agree with Jerry. Oral history interviews were very useful. I interviewed Nelson Candell, who was Jean Clark's lawyer. And you said two. So the other two I want to mention is the University of Baltimore's archives. As I mentioned, I worked with Aiden Faust. He helped Jerry and I both, I believe. The archive there had a lot of Baltimore Sun newspapers, It had the receipt that Jerry showed in his presentation of Sherry Brown, who was a Baltimore Panther, him having to pay for the BG&E bill. And a second one, which is available to, University of Baltimore archives are also available to the public, but there's a website called Freedom Archives, which is a great resource of radical organizers' collections on their writings. I believe there's some audio as well, but their archives are located in Berkeley, California, but they have so much online, and they have stuff about the Black Panther Party, Puerto Rican nationalists, Black nationalists, so much. So if you're interested in doing your own research, I highly, highly recommend the Freedom Archives website. I believe it's just freedomarchives.com, or if you just Google it, you should be able to find it.
Good. Go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering about your research, because I know she was involved with being she's a leader of the Black movement in Baltimore. Lily Carroll Jackson came up at all, and if so, was he with
The question is whether Lily Carroll Jackson came up as part of this research.
Now, you're gonna have to remind me, Lily Carroll Jackson and Juanita Jackson. Lily Carroll Jackson is the mother of Juanita, right? Okay.
Is she one of the first women to get a law degree? I know Lily Carroll Jackson had a daughter who was one of the first Black.
You said it's Juanita. Okay. So, Dr. Harms, correct me if I'm wrong, because you know as much as we do as well, but I remember can you project, was it Lily Carroll Jackson that was opposed to the Panthers using the church for their breakfast program? Yes, so she had opposition to them using one of the churches, a local church for the Panthers breakfast program. And I believe in an interview with Juanita, she also had a negative perception of the Panthers, where she said, we heard that they, killed somebody. And that was, that in itself, that case is befuddled with myths and things
So
like that.
they were influenced by the propaganda of the Black Panthers as well.
Right, I would categorize them within that old guard civil rights ideology, not for the Black Power movement, which the Panthers certainly adhered to. So yeah, they displayed some opposition to the Panthers, and yeah, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Val Traylor, and I am the executive director here at Village Learning Place. Certainly have enjoyed this relationship with the Baltimore Historical Group and having this wonderful curated content that they bring to us each month. So as being one of those kids that benefited from the Black Panthers free breakfast program, I am very, very grateful that you all are studying this. And so my question to you is, you've done the research, and you're very smart about it. Now, what do you plan on doing with it? What's next for you?
No pressure.
No pressure.
The low pressure question is, now that the research has been done, what do they plan to do with it?
I think for me, I was talking about this the other day. Someone asked me, when I was talking to his son, he was really questioning me, what interests you? What did you take away from it? And I think for me, in a weird way, I feel like Whitwire has become sort of a role model for kind of, seeing how involved he was, what he was doing, this always dedication to right, to justice. I think for me has been really motivating in thinking about what I want to do in long term. I'd love to be a lawyer, particularly, public interest or public advocacy. I've done things related to immigration law, and the way he dealt with people and those interpersonal skills and always focused on doing right, I think is something that when I'm thinking about, what I want to do, it's something I've thought about a lot. Now kind of thinking about it and coming towards the end, it's really something I've thought about more. It's kind of, in a way, he's not only been someone I've studied and researched, but in a way kind of I've picked up a lot of, the ways he's approached things and understanding how he viewed justice and always wanting to kind of find ways to help people regardless of who's in their way or what policies or whatever is trying to stop him. So yeah, for me it's been an inspiration.
I would say what I plan to do with this research. So this research actually exposed me to the fact that I hadn't done a lot of research on Black women's radical organizing. That was something that we came into contact while working on the exhibit, the lack of resources on Black women specifically. So I'm going to graduate school, so I plan to do research on Black nationalist women next. Even in my presentation, I noticed I was talking a lot about the Black men in the Panther Party, which of course they deserve to be highlighted, but I was lacking resources on the Black women, so I want to focus on Black women nationalists next. And yes.
So very good presentation. Just want to say that. And you both are undergraduate students.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very impressive. So I just want to first say that. My question is for you, Kristian, about your research on the influence of Maoism in the Black Panther Party. I've seen interviews of Bobby Seale when he talks about, and some ways contest, the notion that the Panthers, in terms of their ideological foundation, are Marxist-Leninists. Like, it was a part of it.
Right.
But he also argues that Black nationalism and, ancient African history was a core part of the foundations of the Black Panther Party. In any of your research, did you see any, and not that those two positions are like opposed to each other necessarily, but there are tensions in terms of some versions of them.
Right.
In any of your research, are there examples of ways with that ideological tension within the Black Panther Party showed up?
That's a really good question.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So let me rephrase and you correct me if I'm wrong, but you essentially asked, was there a tension between the Panthers' ideology on Black nationalism and Marxist-Leninism? Was there a tension, right? Okay, so that was the question. So yes, I did, and I think the Panthers, specifically Eldridge Cleaver, who you mentioned, he mentioned that they studied Mao because Mao pushed Marxism-Leninism beyond its original inception, which was focused on the working class, whereas the Chinese focused on the peasantry, which were essentially below the working class. And the Panthers viewed themselves similarly as the lumpen proletariat, below the working class in the United States. So Eldridge Cleaver, he wrote about that Mao pushed Marxism-Leninism, and he was like, that's why we study Mao, because he didn't just adhere to that white Marxist-Leninism, which the Panthers many times repudiated. So yeah, I think that's my answer to your question, and that's actually a good research question. So I feel like you should do that if you're interested.
Both of you mentioned Warren Hart, who was the government agent who was expelled from the party, even though he was captain of the party. And I'm wondering if either of you are aware that at the Reginald Lewis Museum, in their exhibit of the Black Panther Party, his picture is prominently featured as an admirable member of the Black Panther Party. You're shaking your head and you knew that.
Yes, we know. I think when we were doing our research, someone named Andrea Conti came to speak to us, and he's working on a documentary, I believe, about the Panthers, and that was kind of something that he was really concerned with, the fact that Warren Hart is so prominently figured in the Reginald F. Lewis Museum. That's an issue. That's a big issue. Yeah. I mean, people walking in who don't know or seeing him, yeah, great, he was a Panther. Actually, he was plotting on the real Panthers in the party. So yeah, that's a big issue. I hope that gets resolved. I don't know how soon that would be resolved, but yeah, I'm glad you raised that. Thank you for raising that.
Anyone else? In the back, on the sides?
Can I tell a humorous story about John Clark?
Let's just see if anyone has questions first.
Can I just say,
Please.
I was one of the ones who giggled when we mentioned your people in the 60s and the 50s. So, no, really and truly, the value of the story capturing is terrific, and that's what both of you all have been doing. And for those of us who are of that particular age, and who do have stories from that time, but who also now, my knowledgeableness has been expanded because of the work that you all have been doing. So it's both a thank you and keep it up. Thank you. Thank you so much.
At the risk of doing violence to your comment, the comment was, a lot of us have stories, but what's helpful about the presentations is to provide a context
I
in
know,
which we can
this
think about the
represents
stories.
what John Clark was about. John Clark was a visionary.
Anyone else?
He was
have
a
question?
visionary that But if you look at that picture, his eyes are to the future. We were at a benefit dinner, and I was eating pork chops, and he said, "For a Jew, you should know how to pile away pork chops." I said, "I'm a Reformed Jew." He said, "I'm a Reformed atheist."
Okay, I think we have time for final, you get the final question.
Okay, I'm curious because, like the elder behind me mentioned about, the significance, elder is a term of injection. Mentioned how significant and important it is to capture those stories and how, you also mentioned how it was an amazing resource for yourselves. How are you archiving, documenting, and saving those interviews that you have for future generations?
So some of mine I've submitted to Hopkins. They have an oral history collection that they have, particularly like students or anyone that was kind of related to the university. Yeah, I don't know if any of the, some of the ones I've done, I've collected there, and I want to show.
I just cut in. The general question is, how are they archiving and preserving the interviews and the other information they collect?
Well, you made me realize I haven't, so I need to. The interviews I did with the Baltimore Panthers, they're on my computer. Oh, no, actually, I didn't do any interviews with Baltimore Panthers. When I did an interview with Nelson Kendall, the lawyer, that hasn't been shared anywhere. I think out of the fear of the immaturity of my questions, and because I was a novice historian, I was like, I don't really know, but I should. But for certain, the research I'm doing now, which is on Black nationalism movement, I am sharing that because I think organizers should be hearing that. But yeah, I should do that with the oral histories I did for this project. So thank you for bringing that up, actually.
You want, go ahead.
I just want to start with that my friend Cheryl was in Hopkins and Ms. You can interview her. because the reverend was her advisor, and she interacted with them the whole time.
I love it.
If you want, and she worked in the tutor, so if you want more stories.
Great. Let's thank the two speakers.